For this third week in Advent, we're taking a look at Ruth. Ruth is an interesting individual in that once again, God is connecting someone from outside his chosen people and placing this person, placing Ruth within the lineage of Jesus. So a little backstory on Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. Naomi and her husband Elimelech leave Judah because there's a famine. It seems to be a reoccurring theme in the stories of the Old Testament. But they leave, they move to Moab, they take their two sons. Their two sons marry Moabite women while they're there. Tragedy strikes, and Elimelech and both of their sons die, leaving Naomi with Ruth and Orpah, her daughters-in-law. At this time, Naomi recognizes that she is able to return to Judah, and she tells her daughters-in-law, "You don't need to follow me. In fact, return to your families, return to your fathers. They will care for you." You see, Naomi, as a widow, had no right and no claim to land of her own. She knew that returning to Judah meant that she would be at the mercy of the generosity of others, and she did not want to bring her daughters-in-law into that situation. Orpah returns, goes back to her family. Ruth rejects this. In fact, Ruth plainly states, just don't ask me to leave you. My people will be your people, she says. Your God will be my God. Ruth has pledged herself. She sees a connection point between the marriage she had with Naomi's son as a bond now between she and her mother-in-law. And so Naomi and Ruth return. One of the ways in which they are able to care for themselves is through gleaning. So they are able to go, one of the arrangements that God made in providing for people in need is to instruct that those with fields who are harvesting are not to harvest absolutely everything. So the grain that falls along the side, and a certain portion of grain was not to be harvested, which allows for the gleaning, for the poor to come along behind and to glean. And so Naomi sends Ruth to a relative of her husband's, so a relative of Elimelech's by the name of Boaz. So Ruth goes and she gleans. And word eventually comes to Boaz, particular to who this Moabite woman is. And he has interactions with her, and these are positive interactions, and he comes to learn about who she is, how she is the widow of the son, one of the sons of Elimelech, and someone who, by marriage, was somewhat distantly related to him. This impresses him. Eventually, Boaz seeks to redeem Ruth. As we've talked about previously, this concept of a levirate marriage, where in order to provide for widows, as well as to continue a family line of someone lost in death, the next closest relative is to redeem them, to marry that person, and then provide offspring through that person in the name of the deceased. Boaz is not the closest, but he wants to marry and provide and redeem Ruth. So he sits out in front of the city gate and he engages in conversation and finds the closer relative and basically cuts a deal in order to have Ruth as his own. What we learn at the end of the chapter is that Ruth marries Boaz, and they have a son, Obed, who in turn has another son, Jesse. And that's a name that should sound familiar, because Jesse is then the father of David, future king of Israel. So here is Ruth, a Moabite, who was told by her mother-in-law, "You don't need to stick with me, return to your people." But she respectfully declines, and she seeks to stay with Naomi. She makes the Jewish people her own people. She makes the Jewish God her own God. She sets aside her own gods and follows the one true God, the God of Israel. And God rewards that faithfulness through Boaz and by placing Ruth in the lineage of the Savior for all of mankind, Jews and Moabites alike. What a fun story. Take a look at the 4 chapters of Ruth and just examine the magnificent way in which God brings this Moabite woman into the lineage and the genealogy of Jesus, so that through her faithfulness and her desire to serve and care for her mother-in-law Naomi, God is able to bless the Jews, Moabites, all of us Gentiles. What a wonderful blessing Ruth's faithfulness was in God's gift through her. Blessings, and we'll see you next week for our last installment.